When I lost my husband, my daughter gave me an ultimatum: work or live on the streets. Broken and desperate, I took a job caring for a paralyzed billionaire. But on my very first night there, what I saw left me frozen in fear. Hilda Thompson was 68 years old and had a life marked by simplicity and constancy. For 45 years, she was by Dante's side, a man of few words and firm gestures, with whom she built a routine based on stability. She was known among her neighbors for cultivating a small garden in front of the house, where tulips and daisies always bloomed, even when winter seemed to swallow all the colors. That early spring, however, the garden was withered and silent, as if reflecting the grief weighing down on her. Dante's funeral had taken place just 3 weeks earlier, and every corner of the house still carried the echo of his absence. Hilda mourned like someone carrying a stone on her chest. She woke every day unsure if it still made sense to make coffee, since Dante's chair at the kitchen table remained empty. The picture frames scattered on the shelves, family trips, birthdays, Christmases, were now silent witnesses to a love that seemed to have come to an end. And yet, amidst her suppressed tears, there was a dignity in the way she moved. With each step, even shaky, she tried to hold herself upright, as if her posture were the last thing she could control in a world that had crumbled. It was in this fragile state that her daughter, Harlow, knocked on the kitchen door one gray morning. Harlow, at 42, dressed like a magazine executive, high heels, a fitted blazer, her hair tied in a flawless bun. But her gaze was cold, calculating, like someone entering a negotiation already decided. "Mom, we need to talk," she said, setting her leather bag on the table with a sharp click. Hilda, still wearing her flour-stained apron, stopped stirring the bread she was kneading, sensing something hard would follow. Harlow's words fell like blades. "Either you get a job or you'll end up on the street. I can't bear this burden anymore." The tone wasn't pleading or concerned. It was a sentence. Hilda felt her blood run cold. It wasn't just the content of the words, but the lack of compassion in her daughter's voice that hurt her most. For a moment, she remembered the little girl she'd held, the one who'd fallen asleep countless times nestled in her arms. That memory collided brutally with the woman who now stared at her impatiently. The living room, with the sofa where Dante had so often fallen asleep watching television, seemed to revolve around her. Hilda tried to protest, but her words came out brokenly. "Harlow, 3 weeks. Your father." But her daughter wouldn't listen. She was determined, like someone who had rehearsed that speech dozens of times. With each new word, Hilda felt diminished, reduced to a burden, when for decades she had been the foundation of that house. That night, alone, she cried as she hadn't cried since her youth. It wasn't just mourning her husband, but the shock of realizing that her daughter, her only family, saw her as a disposable burden. The wet pillow seemed a symbol of her powerlessness, and the dark ceiling a mirror of her thoughts. "Am I really worthless?" she wondered, as the moon illuminated the barely drawn curtains. The next day brought a bitter decision. Hilda knew that if she didn't find a way out, she would end up dependent on the goodwill of a daughter who had already shown she had no patience for waiting. With trembling hands, she leafed through the local newspaper, a long-time habit of Dante's. Amid the offers for cleaning, supermarket cashiering, and kitchen work, one headline stood out: "Caregiver wanted to care for quadriplegic billionaire. Above average salary, experience desirable, but not required." She reread the ad 3 times in disbelief. The name in the description, Terence Hawthorne, sounded familiar, yet distant, as if echoed from another world. "Eccentric billionaire, difficult to deal with," the notice read. It was a name that appeared in magazines, always associated with grand deals and low-key scandals. Hilda felt a chill run down her spine. The mere fact of applying for something so far outside her reality seemed almost absurd, but the shadow on the street was even more frightening. In the interview office, a clinical setting with white walls and chrome chairs, Hilda felt out of place. The other candidates seemed younger, more energetic, with prepared resumes and practiced smiles. She, in contrast, clutched the crumpled envelope containing her documents, wearing a simple cotton dress. But there was something about her that none of the others had, a lifetime of resilience. And this, without her realizing it, shone through in her firm gestures and the way she held his gaze. The selection coordinator, a man in a gray suit with an apathetic expression, assessed her over the top of his glasses. He asked quick, bureaucratic questions. "Have you ever cared for someone paralyzed?" Hilda answered sincerely. "Not professionally, but I cared for my husband for years when he was sick." He jotted something down blankly, but the answer seemed to open a window. At that moment, Hilda felt like she might have a chance. When she received the approval call, a mixture of relief and fear washed over her. The relief came from the certainty that she wouldn't have to sleep on the streets. The fear came from the responsibility of dealing with someone known for driving away dozens of caregivers. That same night, as she packed a small suitcase, Hilda looked at her wedding photo with Dante and whispered, "Help me be strong." It was as if asking for permission to move on. That's it. Hawthorne Mansion loomed on the horizon like a somber castle. Tall iron gates, an impeccably manicured garden, yet lifeless, as if every tree were shaped to intimidate, not welcome. The driver who met her barely exchanged a word, and the silence in the car seemed to weigh more heavily than any conversation. When she finally entered the house, Hilda felt the cold marble beneath her feet and the sterile opulence of the walls, covered in cold landscape paintings. It was like entering a soulless world. In the master bedroom, Terence Hawthorne awaited her. The first sight was striking. A man with silver hair, weather-beaten skin, and intense eyes, sitting in an imposing wheelchair, surrounded by medical equipment. His rigid posture contrasted with the fragility of his body. His gaze was hard, almost challenging, as if to say, "We'll see how long you can hold out." Hilda took a deep breath, approached slowly, and without realizing it, her eyes locked with his. And it was at that moment that something inside her trembled. Those eyes weren't strange to her. At that first meeting, Hilda tried to hide the shock. The name, Terence Hawthorne, didn't match the sense of familiarity those eyes evoked in her. They were intense, a deep green, almost feral, piercing her soul. For a second, she found herself back in her 20s sitting in a train station when a young man with an impetuous smile and identical eyes had promised to return. He swallowed hard, remembering that their love had vanished into thin air like smoke, but the resemblance was too disturbing to be a coincidence. Terence broke the silence with his deep voice, still firm, despite his physical limitations. "Are you the new caregiver? How long will it last? A week? 2 days?" There was irony and weariness in his tone, as if he'd already expected her to give up. Hilda took a deep breath before answering, undeterred. "As long as I can be useful, I'll stay." Those simple words seemed to surprise him. For the first time, her lips formed something that might have been a smile, albeit a quick and restrained one. The first few days were a test of endurance. Terence was extremely demanding. He complained about the water temperature, the way the pillows were arranged, even the way Hilda walked around the room. Anyone else would have given up, but Hilda knew the patience of someone who has cared for a husband during his worst days of illness. Silently, she absorbed the criticism and adjusted without taking offense. like someone who understands that pain changes the way we speak. This resilience intrigued Terence, though he would never admit it. One rainy afternoon, while adjusting her medications, Hilda noticed a wooden box on her desk. It was weathered, but the carving on the lid seemed familiar. A small bird with outspread wings. Her fingers trembled, remembering when, at age 20, she had received a medallion with that same symbol as a gift from Terry, the boy who never returned. "Curious," Terence said, noticing her gaze on the object. Hilda hurried to hide it, but unease grew within her. At night, alone in the staff room, Hilda closed her eyes, but the past invaded her mind like an uncontrollable film. She remembered the letters she'd written that were never answered, the white dress she'd kept in vain, the promise of marriage broken without explanation. Dante, though a worthy companion, had never completely erased the mark of that youthful love that vanished without a trace. And now, before her, a man with the same look, the same symbol, the same silence. The next day, Terence was quieter than usual. Hilda took the opportunity to observe him without too much pressure. She noticed the way he frowned when he thought, identical to the way Terry used to do crossword puzzles in his youth. Every detail was a glimpse into a hidden past. Finally, she couldn't resist asking cautiously, "Did you ever live in Ohio? A long time ago?" Terence stared for a few seconds, and then responded with a question. "Why do you want to know?" The answer didn't come easily, but Hilda found the silence even more unbearable. "Because almost 50 years ago, I met a boy who had exactly the same look as you. His name was Terry. He promised to come back for me, but he never did." The words came out like a confession she'd been carrying for decades. The atmosphere grew heavy, and even the sounds of the heart monitor seemed amplified. Terence took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, blurted out, "Hilda." The name spoken that way, with a mixture of disbelief and emotion, broke something inside her. Hilda brought her hand to her mouth, trying to hold back tears. "Is that you?" she murmured, unable to complete the sentence. Terence didn't respond immediately, but the silence was confirmation enough. This was Terry, the same young man who had once departed, leaving a broken promise. Only now he stood before her, marked by time, pain, and accumulated power. But still, it was him. The reunion was a shock of emotions. Hilda wavered between anger at being abandoned and joy at finding him alive. "Why didn't you come back? Why didn't you ever answer?" The questions poured out in a torrent, as if decades of silence had become a dammed river. Terence, his voice choked, replied, "I came back, Hilda. I came back, but they never let you know." The mystery of his words left her confused. The tone of truth he carried made her heart beat faster. That night, Hilda couldn't sleep. She replayed every detail of what she'd heard, trying to piece together a seemingly impossible puzzle. Had Terence returned? Who would have stopped him? How would her life have been different if those letters had arrived? For the first time since Dante's death, Hilda felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Mixed with pain, yes, but hope nonetheless. Over the next few days, their conversations began to deepen. Between pillow adjustments and medication routines, previously heavy words began to turn into confessions. Terence spoke of treacherous partners, intercepted letters, and manipulations to separate them. Hilda listened in silence with suppressed tears, feeling as if her life had been stolen by invisible hands. But at the same time, with each new revelation, she realized that the young love she'd believed dead still pulsed there, stubborn and alive. The weight of the discovery, however, wasn't just hers. Outside the mansion, Harlow was already acting suspiciously. Upon discovering that her mother worked for Terence Hawthorne, he began to spread insinuations. Of course she wants his money. She's always been a gold digger. The words flowed like poison, ready to tarnish Hilda's image. But inside the house, amidst revealed secrets and long glances, something impossible was happening. Two aging hearts were finding a second chance. Over time, Terence's initial rigidity began to soften. He no longer treated Hilda simply as an employee, but as someone who understood him beyond appearances. It was noticeable in the way his voice softened when he called her, or in the way his eyes sought hers when the silence stretched on. Hilda, for her part, felt torn. On the one hand, the weight of Dante's memory still lingered, and on the other, the weight of Dante's memory. On the other hand, the feeling of finding a piece of herself that had been lost for almost half a century began to rekindle in her a flame that she had believed to be extinct. One sunny morning, as Hilda was adjusting the bedroom curtains, Terence surprised her with a question. "Do you still like tulips?" The memory struck her hard, for tulips had been the flowers he had given her on their first date when they were still young. "How could you remember that?" she asked, her voice breaking. He responded only with a tired but tender smile, as if to say that not even decades of distance had been able to erase the essential. Their reunion, however, wasn't just about sweet memories. There was also the pain of all that had been lost. In one of their late-night conversations, Hilda blurted out, "I waited so long, Terry. Then I learned to stop waiting because it hurt so much." He closed his eyes, breathing heavily, and murmured, "It was the greatest injustice of my life, Hilda. They took you from me. They stole our time." These words resonated with her like a belated but deeply validation. Meanwhile, outside the mansion gates, Harlow intensified his smear campaign. He called acquaintances, insinuating that his mother was seducing a wealthy man to secure her own living. "Just imagine, my mother barely out of mourning and already taking care of a billionaire. Do you think that's normal?" The vitriol was spread coldly, and soon the town's gossips began to whisper. Hilda wasn't sure, but she could see it in the looks on some people's faces when she went for quick grocery shopping. One afternoon, Harlow showed up unannounced at the mansion. He entered wearing a navy silk dress and expensive shoes, exuding a strong perfume. "So this is where you've been hiding," he said, looking around disdainfully. Hilda tried to remain calm, but her daughter launched into accusations. "Everyone already knows, Mom. You're trying to take advantage of this vulnerable man. It's shameful." Terence, listening from his wheelchair, reacted with surprising firmness. "No one here is vulnerable, except perhaps your ability to see beyond money." That answer disconcerted Harlow, but only for a moment. "You don't know her like I do. She's always been manipulative." The anger in her voice contrasted with Hilda's serenity, who simply said, "I didn't come here for the money, Harlow. I came because I had no choice, but now I realize fate had more to show me." Her daughter laughed bitterly, as if she believed in nothing but self-interest. She slammed the door, but not before giving him a look that promised revenge. Her relationship with Terry grew even closer after the episode. At one point, while she was serving him tea, he said simply, "You don't deserve to carry the weight of your daughter's words." Hilda swallowed, trying to hide her tears. "It's different when it comes from a stranger, Terry, but when it's your own blood." The pain in her voice made Terence take her hand, with effort but firmly. It was the first physical contact filled with intention since their reunion. This gesture broke an invisible barrier. From that moment on, they began to share not only the present, but also interrupted dreams. They recalled youthful plans, the small house they wanted to build, the trips that never happened. Hilda spoke with nostalgia, but also with a certain liberation, as if each memory were a wound that now healed upon exposure. Terry listened with rare attention, as if each word were a gift that life had finally returned to her. Still, Hilda's internal conflict grew. Deep down, she wondered if she was betraying Dante's memory by allowing herself to feel again. 45 years of marriage can't simply be erased, she murmured to herself on silent nights. But something about Terry, the intensity of their reunion and the recognition of the past, showed that the human heart is capable of harboring multiple forms of love without one canceling out the other. It was in this turmoil that she found a moment of clarity. One quiet afternoon, as she helped Terry leaf through an old photo album he kept, she realized they were both survivors, not just of illness, loss, or old age, but of a fate that tried by all means to separate them. "Maybe that's it, Terry. Maybe we're still here because we need to close what was left open," she said softly. He merely nodded, but there was an emotional gleam in his eyes that said more than any words. While love quietly rekindled, Harlow, on the outside, plotted new strategies. This time, he threatened to take the matter to the local press, saying he would reveal his mother's shameful story. But what she didn't expect was that the truth would begin to emerge from a side not even Hilda knew. Secrets kept by Dante, which, ironically, would turn the tables and expose that no one, not even her idealized husband, was who they seemed. Fate chose an unlikely moment to reveal its hidden secrets. It was one quiet morning, as Hilda was sorting through some old boxes Harlow had left in her mother's basement. Among yellowed papers and family albums, she found a sealed envelope with Dante's name written in strange, undoubtedly feminine handwriting. Her heart raced. With trembling hands, she opened the letter and read words that made her feel as if the ground had fallen away. Declarations of love signed by a woman named Evelyn, mentioning secret encounters that had taken place years before. Hilda sat on the cold floor, staring at the lines as if they were knives. Dante, her faithful husband and companion of nearly half a century, had led a parallel life she had never suspected. The letters revealed not only encounters, but a relationship kept secret until the last years of his life. The pain was sharp, almost unbearable. "So that was it," she murmured, feeling both deceived and liberated. The immaculate image Harlow had defended so fervently had deep cracks. When Harlow learned of the discovery, she reacted with disbelief. "That's a lie. These letters mean nothing." But when she saw the repeated handwriting on several envelopes, some even dated to her father's business trips, she couldn't deny it. It was as if a mirror had shattered before her. Her father, whom she had always used as an example to criticize her mother, had betrayed everyone's trust. Harlow staggered, feeling the pedestal she had placed Dante on crumble beneath her feet. The revelation changed the tone of the relationship between mother and daughter. For the first time, Harlow remained silent before Hilda, unable to accuse her. What he saw now was a woman who had endured not only recent widowhood and her daughter's rejection, but also the belated discovery of a cruel infidelity. It was impossible to ignore the strength Hilda demonstrated. How did you manage to live so long without realizing?" Harlow asked in an almost childish tone. Hilda sighed and replied, "Because I chose to believe. Sometimes love is also a choice of trust, even when we don't know the whole truth." Terence followed, everything with discreet attention. When he was alone with Hilda, he said to her, "Now, you understand, don't you? It was never about being unlovable. It was about circumstances, manipulation, other people's choices. Not even Dante could be the man you thought he was." Hilda, though shaken, felt those words were healing. It was as if she could finally free herself from the shadow of a marriage that, while honorable in many ways, had also denied her transparency. Harlow, shaken, began avoiding visitors for a few days. Her silence was, in itself, a confession that she was trying to process everything. For Hilda, this distance brought unexpected relief. For the first time in weeks, she could care for Terry without feeling her daughter's accusatory gaze. This space allowed their relationship to deepen even further, now without the direct interference of outside voices. With each day, it seemed as if the bonds of the past found new ways to renew themselves in the present. On a serene evening, as the rain gently beat against the mansion's windows, Hilda and Terry had a fateful conversation. If time has stolen 50 years from us, what we still have cannot be wasted, he said, his eyes welling with tears. Hilda hesitated, but knew he was right. The love that remained, mature and conscious, was a rare opportunity. I don't want my last years to be just memories. I want them to be lived, she replied. It was the beginning of a decision that would change everything. Before they could make their decision official, Harlow returned even more upset. She brought with her an explicit threat. If you persist in this ridiculous affair, I will expose everything publicly. I will tell them you're using the Hawthorne name for your own benefit, that you never respected Dad's memory. But this time, Hilda didn't tremble. She held her daughter's gaze firmly and said calmly, "You can say whatever you want, Harlow, but know that I don't need anyone's approval to be happy." It was the first time Harlow saw her mother standing up straight, unapologetic in the face of accusations. That stance struck a chord with her in an unexpected way. Behind the anger, something was beginning to unravel, an old envy, an unspoken resentment at the feeling that her mother had always sacrificed herself to keep the family afloat, while she, Harlow, struggled for recognition. The clash that night didn't bring immediate reconciliation, but it left a fissure through which empathy began to seep. Terry, a silent witness to this transformation, later confided in Hilda, "Your strength is what keeps me alive. You don't just care for me. You remind me why it's still worth fighting for." These words were like a balm for her, who still carried the insecurity of not being enough. For the first time in a long time, Hilda slept peacefully, feeling that she was not just a survivor, but a protagonist of her own story. The tide was turning. The past, once used against her, now became a tool of liberation. Hilda understood that overcoming wasn't about erasing the pain, but about facing it head-on and refusing to be defined by it. The reunion with Terry, Dante's letters, her daughter's fury, all converged on the same point, the chance to rebuild her life, this time on her own terms. And this recognition, more than any outward gesture, was the spark of true overcoming. The announcement of the decision came on a golden autumn afternoon. Hilda, wearing a simple dress and steady hands, looked at Terry and said clearly, "I no longer want to live among fears and silences. If we still have time, let it be to love, not to justify." Terry, with teary eyes, simply nodded. The weight of half a century seemed to dissolve in a few words. It was at that moment that they decided to marry, without luxury, without the press, simply with the simplicity of those who know the value of what cannot be bought. The news fell like a bombshell on Harlow when he heard it from his own. "Mother," he exploded, "this is absurd. You're marrying a billionaire. You'll become a joke. People will laugh at you, Mom, don't you see?" But Hilda calmly replied, "Let them laugh. Dignity isn't in what they think of me, but in what I choose for myself." It was the first time Harlow couldn't immediately retort. His usual coldness gave way to a lost look, as if he no longer knew where he was standing. The wedding was planned in secret, in a small garden behind the mansion, where ancient trees held silent stories. Only a few trusted staff members were present, witnessing something that felt more intimate than any grand celebration. Hilda wore a discreet white linen dress and carried yellow tulips in her hands, like the ones she had seen on her first date with Terry. He, seated in his wheelchair, wore a light gray suit, and as he held her hand, he seemed decades younger. During the ceremony, tears streamed down Hilda's face. They weren't tears of sadness, but of liberation. Behind the veil of simplicity lay the grandeur of a life rewritten. Terry, pronouncing the vows, said, "They stole almost 50 years from us, but what we still have will be ours, free from lies and manipulation." Each word echoed like an act of resistance against time and against everything that had tried to separate them. Harlow appeared at the gate, late and uninvited. She watched from afar, in the shadow of the trees, unable to decide whether to continue her criticism or simply watch. Her heart was a battleground. On one side, wounded pride; on the other, the revelation that her mother was not the fragile woman she had always imagined. For the first time, she saw Hilda not as a burden, but as someone who had the courage to rebuild her life when everyone expected her to merely survive. At the end of the ceremony, as the guests were dispersing, Harlow approached. There was a hardness in his eyes, but also a hint of vulnerability. "I don't know if I can accept this, Mother," he said, almost in a whisper. Hilda, without hesitation, took his hand and replied, "You don't have to accept it now. Just don't close your eyes to what's true." Those words, simple and disarming, penetrated deeply into Harlow, who for once didn't respond with irony or contempt. He simply remained silent. The days that followed were of gradual transformation. News of the wedding spread, of course, and malicious gossip arose. But Hilda no longer cared. What mattered was waking up next to Terry, making him coffee, and sharing conversations that recaptured fragments of youth and projected belated dreams. These weren't grandiose future plans, but small things. Walks in the garden, old songs, letters stored in boxes. Every detail was experienced as a victory against lost time. Harlow, still resistant, began visiting his mother more often. He didn't come to praise, but to observe. And with each visit, something changed in his gaze. Once, seeing his mother laugh beside Terry, he murmured, "I haven't seen her like smile since I was a child." It was an involuntary confession, but one packed with impact. Hilda simply smiled in response, as if she no longer needed to prove anything to anyone. The turning point between mother and daughter came when Harlow, revisiting Dante's letters, cried for the first time in front of Hilda. "I idealized Dad. I couldn't bear the thought of him failing, so I blamed you entirely. I guess I never wanted to see it." Hilda embraced her without judgment, simply letting her daughter pour out years of pent-up resentment. It was a silent but powerful moment of true reconciliation. Over time, Harlow stopped seeing Terry as a vulnerable billionaire and began to see him as a man who, despite his wealth, carried pain, regret, and the courage to rebuild himself. This recognition changed the way she treated her mother's relationship. There was still distrust, but also a new respect, born of confronting the truth. Hilda and Terry's marriage not only transformed their lives, it was also a symbolic milestone for Harlow. He saw for the first time that starting over is possible at any age, and that one shouldn't use the past as a chain to imprison the present. For Hilda, it was more than a marriage. It was a definitive liberation. For the first time, she lived not to fulfill expectations, but to honor her own desires. And so, what began as a story of loss, rejection, and abandonment transformed into something greater, a living lesson that it's never too late to rewrite one's destiny. Hilda's smile, now bright and serene, was proof that overcoming lies not only in surviving, but in allowing oneself to blossom again, even after the cruelest storms. Marriage brought Hilda a new routine, marked by simplicity and meaning. Every day she woke early, opened the curtains in Terry's room, and let the morning light in. It was as if the sun, once an indifferent observer of her pain, now came to celebrate the new beginning. Small rituals became making precious. Tea, listening to old songs on the radio, reading books aloud to him. Hilda felt that, for the first time, she was living fully, without haste and without the weight of masks. Terry, for his part, seemed more alive than ever. Even limited by his wheelchair, he found in Hilda the strength he had sought in vain for decades. "You are my breath, Hilda," he would say often, as he watched her water the flowers in the garden. The man the world knew as a ruthless billionaire appeared beside her, vulnerable and human. It was a version of himself no one had seen, except the young woman he had loved and now met again in the autumn of his life. The tulips, which Hilda replanted in the mansion's garden, became a symbol of this new phase. Every day she tended them delicately, and each blossom that blossomed was a silent confirmation that new beginnings are possible. Harlow, seeing his mother kneeling in the dirt, handling the flowers with her dirt-stained hands, felt a mixture of estrangement and respect. "I never thought I'd see you like this again. Alive," he confessed during an unexpected visit. The mother-daughter relationship progressed slowly, like someone learning to walk on unfamiliar ground. Harlow still carried pride and wounds, but the hardness was beginning to dissolve. There were moments when she almost allowed herself to laugh alongside her mother, though she still held back for fear of giving in too much. But little by little, Hilda realized, reconciliation wouldn't come with grandiose words, but with small gestures that accumulated like solid stones building a new bridge. One afternoon, Hilda found Harlow standing before Dante's grave. Her daughter wept silently, clutching one of Evelyn's letters. When she noticed her mother's presence, she tried to hide her tears, but Hilda simply reached out and touched her shoulder. "He was the father you loved, Harlow, and none of this changes the love you felt. But we must learn to deal with the truth without letting it destroy us." For the first time, Harlow allowed herself to be held, accepting her mother's embrace without resistance. Time passed, and the town rumors began to fade. People once eager for gossip found new targets for comment. Hilda no longer cared. What mattered were the days of serenity with Terry and the increasingly human bond she was rebuilding with Harlow. The freedom to not live for the eyes of others was perhaps the greatest achievement of all. The culmination of this transformation came at a simple dinner, just the three of them gathered at the table. Harlow, after a long silence, looked up and said, "I didn't understand your choices for a long time, Mom. But today I see you were brave, braver than I could ever be." The words echoed through the room like absolution. Hilda held her daughter's hand without tears or speeches, just the weight of a gesture that said, "We still have time." For Terry, that dinner was a milestone. "You two are stronger together than apart," she said, her voice firm. And indeed, there was truth to that. The mother-daughter reunion didn't erase years of hurt, but it showed that forgiveness is often the final stage of healing. It wasn't about forgetting, but about choosing not to let pain dictate the next chapters. The last few months were lived to the fullest. Hilda and Terry began receiving visits from neighbors, not as a source of gossip, but as an example of resilience and tenderness. Many marveled. Who would have thought that at 68 she would find a new love? But for Hilda, it wasn't about age, but rather about the courage to resist silence. Life, after all, still offered her days to live, and she was willing to seize them. One spring morning, Hilda was walking through the garden when she noticed that the tulips had bloomed in abundance. The gentle wind ruffled the yellow petals, and she smiled to herself, remembering the young woman who had once waited in vain at the train station. Now she understood that the wait had not been in vain. It had merely been postponed. "It's never too late to bloom," she thought, taking a deep breath. The outcome of her journey wasn't about proving anything to others, but about living at peace with herself. She rebuilt her love, reclaimed her dignity, and, above all, reconnected with her daughter. When she looked at Terry, she saw her childhood companion finally returned. And when she looked at Harlow, she saw the hope that the mistakes of one generation needn't imprison the next. It was the circle of life closing in an unexpected but beautiful way. Thus, Hilda Thompson ended a cycle that began with grief, rejection, and abandonment, but ended with reunion, reconciliation, and blossoming. Her story became a silent but powerful testament to the fact that true overcoming lies not in erasing scars, but in using them as proof that resistance is possible. At 68, she proved that it's never too late to start over, and that even the harshest winter can pave the way for a new spring. The serenity of the following months didn't mean an absence of movement, it meant choice. Hilda realized that her story, so private for decades, now had public value. She began shyly. She wrote a simple account on social media, recounting how she had started over at 68 without naming names, only feelings, smells, and scenes. The warm bread in the morning, the soft music on the radio, the empty chair that once hurt and then became a space for hope. Within hours, comments from strangers poured in, like notes left on the gate. "Thank you for reminding me that there's still time." She read them all calmly, responding one by one, like someone watering plants. The impact of this text surprised her. Women of various ages told stories of loss and new beginnings. Caregivers narrated invisible journeys. Widowers spoke of longing that turned to silence. Hilda, who always thought she was nothing special, discovered that simple honesty was a beacon in troubled seas. She then created an anonymous page, Tulips in Winter, to share weekly chronicles, small snippets of everyday life, what she learned as a caregiver and as a wife again, the light weight of two hands holding hands while the kettle whistles. Harlow read in secret for weeks before admitting to following along. At first, she turned up her nose when she saw her mother on the internet. But the tone wasn't exhibitionism, it was companionship. One night, after seeing a cruel comment accusing Hilda of fortune hunting, Harlow impulsively responded, "That woman has worked and loved her entire life. You have no idea." It was her first public gesture of defense. "You defended me?" Hilda asked the next day, somewhere between astonishment and tenderness. Harlow looked away, embarrassed. Someone had to say it. Not everyone reacted with support. A former director of Terry's conglomerate, uncomfortable with the humanization of the man who had helped build a steel legend, began insinuating that Hilda was influencing decisions. Well-intentioned proposals arose for her to sign power of attorney documents just to speed up day-to-day matters. Hilda, who had learned to read between the lines, politely declined. "My place is to take care of him, not the money." She stated in writing that she preferred a regime of absolute separation and zero interference in the business. Her firm courtesy dismantled traps. Terry noticed the commotion and requested a meeting with the board. The mirrored room, long table, and a scene of silent wars. Hilda entered quietly, but with her spine straight. When they suggested she step aside to avoid image conflicts, she responded without raising her voice, "I'm not an image, I'm a person, and I'm a wife. If the concern is governance, document the separation of assets review audits, create barriers, but don't decree solitude as a policy. The silence that followed was the capitulation of those who hadn't expected lucidity from a woman they called housekeeper. Life rewards clarity with new trials. On a cold late afternoon, Terry became short of breath. His breath became short, his skin clammy. Alarms went off like flocks of birds. The ambulance cut through the city, and Hilda, her hand on his shoulder, whispered, "Look at me. Stay with me." At the hospital, time became elastic. Minutes that hurt like hours. Harlow arrived uninvited, without makeup or armor, carrying a bottle of water and a blanket. "You're not spending this night alone." The ICU had lights that never learned to whisper. Hilda sat by the window and, for the first time in a long time, prayed without words, only memories. Terry's laughter at 20, Dante's silence at 70, Harlow's face at 5, asking for stories. When the doctor explained the pneumonia and the next steps, she wanted to collapse, but she got up. She walked to the bed, rested her forehead against his, and promised, "If you're tired, I understand. But if there's still an ember in there, I'll blow it out with you." The generous dawn brought small victories, an oxygen level that rose, a fever that subsided, a line on the monitor that became less stubborn. At dawn, Hilda and Harlow shared lukewarm coffee and a painless silence. "I've always been afraid of losing you to someone, as if there was no place for me in your adult life," Harlow confessed, surprising herself. Hilda held his hand, wrinkled and finding her manicured nail. "There was always a place. It was just me who took a while to come out of the..." Convalescing, Terry returned home with a newfound humility before his body and time. On the first sunny day, he asked to go to the garden. Hilda led him to the tulips, now in full bloom, and he let out a low laugh. "It's as if the season was waiting for us." They sat there unhurriedly, talking about trifles, the cloud that looked like a fish, the eager little bird, as if they understood that life resides on the edge of the extraordinary. The hospital experience planted a resolve. "I want to go back to the station," Terry said, referring to the place where, as young people, they believed in the promise that wasn't fulfilled. Hilda felt a pleasant butterflies in her stomach, the kind of fear that announces courage. Harlow listened and, to their surprise, offered, "I'll take you. We'll make this our own trip." 3 generations crammed into a car, past, present, and a possibility of the future, set off on a clear morning, with simple sandwiches and a thermos of apple tea. The station was smaller than memory would allow, like everything that had endured. The paint was peeling, the grandfather clock had stopped, a wooden bench that was showing the weight of years. Hilda walked to the exact spot where she had waited decades ago and pulled an envelope from her pocket, a letter to the 20-year-old who believed promises were straight tracks. She read it aloud, not to the internet, not to applause, but to herself. "You will survive what you don't understand, and one day understand what you have survived." Late that afternoon, Terry handed her a worn wooden box with a bird carved into the lid. It wasn't a ring, it was the locket that had been missing from the day of their ancient goodbye, kept for years like a reliquary of a suspended time. Hilda opened it, found a short note, "Sorry I'm late," and laughed with hot tears, the best combination the human face can conjure. Harlow took a photo of the two of them, unfiltered, and wrote in the family group, "Sometimes what comes late comes on time." On her return, Hilda published a column in Tulips in Winter about promises that bend but never break. She spoke of the creaking bench, the stopped clock, and the body that learns to carry on even when time pulls against it. The text didn't have a moral lesson. It had substance. In the comments, a 72-year-old woman wrote, "I'll start tomorrow." Hilda closed her cell phone slowly. as if keeping a diamond in her apron pocket, and whispered to Terry, head on his shoulder, "We still have a road." Returning to the station marked A before and after. Hilda realized she no longer carried the weight of an unfinished past. Now she had a full present. This clarity inspired her to expand. Tulips in Winter. What began as weekly reports became a vibrant community, with thousands of people exchanging stories of loss and new beginnings. Elderly people found the courage to return to school. Women revived failed businesses. Men began to love again after decades of silence. "I'm not a writer," Hilda said, but her texts were beacons because they were born from scars. Terry proudly encouraged, "You've always been good at listening. Now you've learned to put it into words." And Harlow, who had previously despised the project, began to help discreetly, proofreading text, organizing messages. "It's nothing," he explained. But Hilda knew it was her daughter's way of apologizing and at the same time getting closer. For the first time, working side by side on something that wasn't a burden or an obligation, but a choice. Terry's company's board of directors tried another tactic. They proposed that Hilda become an image ambassador, complete with interviews and events. The idea was to use her as a marketing tool, to transform her story into a product. Hilda firmly refused. "My life isn't a spectacle. My commitment is to my readers, not to shareholders." The refusal sounded rebellious, but Terry supported it, closing the meeting with a simple statement: "I'll spend the time I have left with her, not with graphics." Meanwhile, Terry's health fluctuated. There were days of energy and laughter, but also afternoons of silence and profound exhaustion. Hilda learned to adapt to the rhythm of his body without denying reality. It wasn't an illusion of eternity, it was gratitude for today. This clarity brought them even closer. At night, lying side by side, she would say, "It doesn't matter how much time matters, how we use it." And he would respond, "With you, every moment is whole." Harlow, increasingly present, began to transform as well. She discovered she could be a daughter without being a tormentor, that she could protect without suffocating. One night, while helping her mother arrange the tulips in the garden, she confessed, "I always thought you were weak. Now I see that being strong was never about shouting. It was about resisting in silence." Hilda smiled. Her tears held back and replied, "And I always wanted you to be happy, even when I didn't know how to show it." Hilda's project gained unexpected attention. A local journalist, captivated by the writing in Tulips in Winter, asked for an interview. Hilda hesitated, but Terry encouraged her. "Tell it your way. No makeup." In the report, Hilda spoke of loss, new beginnings, and the courage to live at 68. She didn't mention fortunes, nor did she mention the billionaire beside her. She simply shared the humanity of her experience. The text went viral, not for its gossip, but for its authenticity. Thousands of people shared it, writing, "She talked about me." This bothered those who still saw the benefit of using the Hawthorne name, but the positive response was so great that even the critics had to give in. Hilda not only rebuilt her own life, she became a voice for so many who didn't know where to begin. The power of her simplicity defeated the most well-laid intrigues. One clear morning, Terry asked to return to the company for the last time. He wanted to officially say goodbye. With Hilda and Harlow by his side, he entered the meeting room and declared, "My life no longer fits in balance sheets. The legacy I want to leave is not in numbers, but in people." He formally handed over the reins to new management and left without looking back. Hilda held his hand and Harlow walked on the other side. It was the end of a cycle that no longer defined them. In the garden, they celebrated simply. Harlow brought a small improvised cake and they toasted with tea. "You know what else I learned?" Hilda said, looking at her daughter. that we don't need to be afraid of the end. We just need to live in a way that makes sense until then. Harlow, moved, replied, "You taught me that, and I'll never forget it." The outcome began to take shape one spring afternoon. Terry, now frail, asked Hilda to take him to the blooming tulips. Sitting in silence, he observed each petal as if saying goodbye to old friends. "I don't know how much longer I have, Hilda, but I'm not afraid, because you're here." She held his hand and replied, "And I will be here until my last breath, Terry, and beyond that, too." That night, he wrote another column for Tulips in Winter. He spoke of love that doesn't fade with age, of forgiveness that comes not from speeches but from gestures, and of new beginnings that blossom when we least expect it. He concluded with a simple phrase, "If you're still breathing, there's still time." When he posted it, he never imagined it would become the most read piece of all, a manifesto of hope that would cross invisible boundaries. Thus, the climax of the journey approached, not like a noisy spectacle, but like the gentleness of a changing season. Hilda's life, once marked by grief, rejection, and abandonment, was now summed up in two words that resonated with everyone who knew her: dignity and love. The rest was detail. The following months were lived as a rare gift. Her time with Terry was finite, but instead of dreading it, she learned to savor each moment. Every tea served, every story remembered, every laugh at dusk was lived as if it were unique. Fear gave way to gratitude. Even Harlow, who had previously seen his mother as a burden, now sat at the table with them, sharing conversations about childhood memories and small plans, like painting the garden together next season. The day of farewell arrived on a calm, unassuming morning. Terry, already weakened, held Hilda's hand and whispered, "Thank you for waiting. Even when I didn't come back, you never truly left me." She wept, but not with despair. She wept with the peace of someone who knows the story has finally had its missing chapter. He departed silently, in the room lit by the tulips Hilda had picked and placed in a vase beside the bed. It was a dignified end, accompanied by love. The morning this time was different. There was no void without answers, as with Dante. There was pain, yes, but also fulfillment. Hilda wore white to the funeral instead of black. "I'm not burying an absence, I'm celebrating a reunion that time has brought back to us," she said to those who found her choice strange. The simplicity of the ceremony moved even those who had previously criticized her. Harlow remained by her side the entire time, holding her hand tightly as if finally understanding what it meant to be a daughter. In the days that followed, Hilda returned to the garden with a new routine. She watered the tulips and wrote letters to Terry, which she published on the Tulips in Winter page. They were short, almost whispered texts that spoke of longing and gratitude. The virtual community grew even more, transforming into a support space for thousands of people. Without realizing it, Hilda had become a symbol of resilience and hope, not through grand speeches, but by living truthfully. Harlow, in turn, changed from the inside out. She became her mother's defender, face of any criticism, and it didn't take long for her to admit, "I've never seen you so alive, Mom. I spent my life trying to control everything, and you showed me that life is more about accepting what comes." It was in this recognition that full reconciliation finally took place. The hurts weren't erased, but transformed into learning experiences. Hilda finally saw her daughter as a woman capable of loving without the armor of coldness. Time passed, and Hilda's project took on new forms. Publisher approached her to transform her chronicles into a book. She hesitated, but accepted on one condition: that it be published without glamour, simply as a testimony. The title chosen was Tulips in Winter, Stories of New Beginnings. The book circulated through the hands of strangers, but also reached homes where loneliness was loud. Each letter, each story she published became fuel for other lives that needed to flourish. A year after Terry's death, Hilda and Harlow returned to the train, stationed together. The bench still creaked, the clock still stopped, but now there was no sadness, only memory. Harlow held up his cell phone camera and said, "Let's capture this moment." They took a photo together, smiling at the tulips they had brought with them. "This is where it all began and began again, Mom," their daughter said. Hilda simply smiled, letting the wind carry her answer. Back in the garden, in the mansion that now felt like home, Hilda wrote her final column for the page. "Today, I don't speak of loss, but of seeds, because every pain I buried blossomed into something greater, and every weight that seemed pointless was just preparation for the right season." If anyone is reading this, know this: it's never too late, no matter your age, your history, your weight, or your guilt. If you're still breathing, you can still blossom. It was her most shared piece, reaching people in places she never imagined. Hilda's story didn't end in silence. It became a legacy for Harlow. It became a lesson that life is broader than the control we try to impose. For anonymous readers, it was an anchor amidst storms. For Hilda, it was simply living to the end with dignity. The tulip garden, once a metaphor for absence, now bore witness to a new beginning. The flowers bloomed the following winter, as if to say, she won. That morning, as she looked up at the sky and felt the wind on her face, Hilda whispered, "Thank you, Dante, for giving me a story. Thank you, Terry, for giving me back hope. Thank you, Harlow, for coming back to me. And thank you, life, for showing me that it's never too late." And with that sigh, she closed the cycle of an existence marked by pain, struggle, and above all, overcoming.